My name is Gerard. Gerard. I'm from Liverpool originally, but I live in London. I've been here for about 10 years. I've been doing been in charge of iKnit London for about 5 years. I started knitting only about 8 years ago. I didn't really realise I wanted to learn to knit, but I lived with a friend who was quite crafty, and I was ill at the time when I asked her to teach me, and realised that I really loved it, and I've been knitting since then. Really, I started iKnit London about 3 years after I learned, and it just kind of extended from a hobby into something I did to pass the weekends, and it's just taken over. Really, it's just my whole life now.
I've been knitting, since I was 3, or thereabouts, so that's over 50 years now. One of my earliest memories is sitting in the kitchen showing Grandma how well I could knit. So I've been doing it for a while. I don't remember who taught me. I would think more likely to have been Mum rather than Grandma, because Grandma lived 50 miles away. But she must have been on a visit and I was showing her me knitting. Mum learnt to knit when she was young, and she knitted clothes for dolls, and I would think clothes for herself as well. And then when she had me and my sisters, I've got an older and a younger sister, she learnt to knit things like baby clothes and so on, because it was cheaper than buying when you've got 3. So quite probably I'd seen her knitting and gone, "Mummy, Mummy, I want to do it too," as kids do. And I was always good with my hands. I would think even at that age, sort of 3 or so.
I'm originally a Yorkshire girl, but been living down in London for about 35 years. And been knitting probably most of my life off and on. I first learnt with my mother, who used to knit sort of complicated Aran sweaters. But I also learnt from one grandmother who knitted in a very correct English style with the fingers flicking and the small economy of movement. I had a Yorkshire grandmother who used to knit on long straight knitting needles with the knitting needle under her arm, and it was all done out here. And consequently my knitting style is sort of very much a hodgepodge of what works for me at the time. I've also got arthritis now, so it depends on how well my hands are working at the time as to which way I hold the yarn, which way I hold the needles, and how I actually get on with the craft.
So I've been knitting since I was 6 years old, so I've been knitting for quite a long time. Probably wasn't so interested in it when I was a kid, but I started to study fashion and textiles, so I learned to knit again, and just kind of since then I kind of found iKnit London while I was studying, and just really got into the hand knitting. My mum taught me to knit when I was about 6 years old, and also my gran as well, so I had kind of both of them teaching me to knit, but I don't know, I didn't really get into it until I was taught by a technician at my college where I was studying fashion and textiles. She kind of got me back into it because she was going to the Stitch and Bitch groups, and kind of at the time there was the kind of sort of knitting revival where it was sort of becoming a lot more popular, a lot more people were getting into knitting. iKnit London opened, so that was kind of like my haven at the time.
Knitting is really addictive, and it's very therapeutic. It can be a great therapy. It can be used just to pass the time, or it can be used to help pain management for arthritis. It can be used to help mental disorders, mental stress, all kinds of different things. I just do it because I really like it. Really.
It's really caught on again recently. There's been some celebrity knitters and so on. I think it's just come back into fashion. I mean, I've never really stopped.
You've always been in fashion?
Oh yes. But there's been times when I've done more cross-stitch, embroidery, sewing and so on. But there's always been knitting. And I got really active again about, I suppose, 10 years ago. Some friends dared me to knit a Darth Maul doll from Star Wars. And I'd done dolls before, I'd been doing Harry Potter dolls. And for some reason there's an awful lot of popularity for Severus Snape dolls. I've knitted a lot of those. But a friend dared me to knit a Darth Maul doll, and then I knitted an octopus with different things in its hands to do with music, because I was in a music group. So we had this musical octopus.
Yeah, I think most people, without realising it, continue to knit in the manner of the way they were taught. So, for example, somebody who's been taught to do a cast-on in one way will use that cast-on regardless. But yeah, there's about sort of 12, 13 different variations of cast-ons, and each one is better for a different purpose, different type of yarn, different edging, fixture and things like that. So, and what I found was that I was going around the country teaching people to knit at a number of the craft shows. And different parts of the country, people would hold the needles very differently, they would hold the yarn very differently, and they would do a cast-on very differently. And it was quite geographic. So, for example, when I was teaching up in Scotland, the knitters there preferred to knit on very long, sort of 14-inch long needles, which they frequently put under their armpit, and you know, things like that. So yeah, it is quite geographic. I think that developed from different styles of knitting, because knitting originally, people didn't knit with needles as such. My grandma used to call it wires. She used to knit with wires, and effectively what she had was long lengths of steel, but possibly bicycle spoke style, something, whatever. And my gran, who was Yorkshire, used to knit with the steel in a goose wing sheath, which was like a wooden carved thing which would sit under your armpit with the end of the steel into the wooden sheath. Whereas in Scotland, the Shetland knitters would work with a Shetland knitting belt, where you'd have the same length wires, but they'd wear a leather belt with a padded horsehair pouch on it, with holes punched in it, and they would tuck the end of the wire into the padded belt, and they would actually have one needle held like that, and they would only move the other needle. So it's quite derivative as to the styles that were around at the time, whatever. I'm adamant when I teach people to knit, there is no one correct way. There is what works for you, that gives you the stitch definition, that gives you the gauge with your yarn, that gives you the finished project that you yourself like and want. It's as individual as that. Every single person who comes here could all be given exactly the same needles, exactly the same yarn, told to knit exactly the same thing, and you would end up with sort of 20, 30 individual pieces that bore no resemblance to each other. Which is part of the fun of it as well, because it is so personal and so creative. The arthritis, it certainly helps me to keep my fingers moving and to actually keep my hands going. If I don't knit every day, even if it's only 2 or 3 rows, my hands the next morning are sort of much stiffer, they're not quite so agile and whatever. I found that rather than the straight needles, I'm actually on a short circular needle, and that's actually, again, it's a different way for me to hold them. And at the moment, because I'm talking to you, I'm just doing this on very simple repetitive movement, but if I was to be knitting this at home watching the TV and not having to talk to anybody or anything like that, then I would probably have the yarn held in this hand, wrapped around my finger, doing it like this, and sort of doing an entirely different version of the stitch, getting exactly the same result, but one I have to look at and the other one I don't. I think if I was more practised in this technique, which is called a continental knit, then I probably wouldn't need to look at it. But as it stands, simple repetitive movement, I'm like, that's it.
We started I Knit London by organising a twice monthly, I think, and then weekly knitting group in the pub. We used to get 20, 30, 40, sometimes 100 people, especially in the winter. 100 people in. Traditionally, knitting groups and communities were organised, before globalisation, before the internet. They were organised to help each other. Really, it wasn't just about the social. It was about helping a community, often making a blanket for one house, something for another house, something for another house, or the community house. And within those groups, the traditions were passed on down generations, and that's where you learned. So you do. You don't just meet people with similar interests. You learn from each other. It's not just learning the skills. You can learn. You can find out where to get a pattern from or where to get a yarn from. So passing on inspiration is really important as well. It's a bit like Harry Potter, the knitting world. There's all kinds of explanations and phrases used in the knitting world that aren't available anywhere else. But there's yarn swaps. People have yarn swaps where someone has an open house and everyone brings yarn they don't want to use, and then we just swap it among ourselves. I don't particularly like that because I want them to buy it. But that happens quite a lot. Yeah, but things are always being passed on for charities and things like that. Yeah, odds and ends. And the single best thing about working in a knitting shop really is that the people you spend your day with are usually, it sounds a bit cheesy, but they're usually really nice people. They're usually lovely. I only learned to knit recently compared to some of the customers, most of the customers. Most of them are women, and so it's kind of, it's become a kind of known as a feminine activity really. So most of our customers are women, and they did learn when they were children, and some of them have been knitting, you know, twice as long as I've been alive.
This scarf is adapted slightly from one on Ravelry, the knitting website. And a friend showed it me because I'd got the same yarn, and I tried it with the number of stitches that the pattern said, and it didn't quite work because I knit either more tightly or more loosely than the person who did the original. So I've actually got 2 more stitches on the needles than the original, and that was trial and error, trying more stitches, a few stitches, seeing what worked.
Unfortunately, I have a lot of projects on the go. I'm a compulsive starter of projects. I'm probably, people talk about, are you a project knitter or a process knitter? And I think I'm a process knitter. I like the knitting process. I want something to be doing. I don't necessarily want to be doing exactly the same thing every day. I don't want to be knitting. I don't like knitting the same item more than once. I like a change. Depending on how my hands are working is whether I want to be knitting fine lace work or whether I'm happy to be knitting with thicker needles, chunky wool, and whatever. So I tend to have a range of projects going from 2-ply lace right down to some super chunky or bulky wool. So depending on how my hands are in the morning, that's the project I pick up and bring with me. Yeah, and I mean, and also my knitting is done. I don't know, people's images of knitters are people who sit at home knitting quietly, you know, on their own thing. And I've never done that. I work long hours. I commute daily, and my commute is anything between an hour and a half to 2 hours to get to work and an hour and a half, 2 hours to get home over night time. When you could, you know, and you're just sitting on a bus wasting time, why don't you use it for doing something else? So that's when I suddenly thought, yeah, it was stupid me. Why don't I think I'll take my knitting with me on the bus? And since then, I have done it non-stop.
For me, knitting's not about the end product. No, it's about it's the activity. Yeah, I really enjoy the process. Some people really want to get to the end, because they enjoy the products. But I enjoy the process actually. Most of the things I make, I give away.
It depends on your taste in your yarn, what you like to use, and what your income is, what your budget is. I think most knitters will, you know, if there's something that is a really special yarn, then they will save up. They want to make for some sort of special item, they will save up, they will budget for it, they'll buy it. The rest of us are absolute sort of sale junkies and will, you know, you have a favourite yarn and somebody says it's on sale somewhere at 25% off and you're in there. You know, there are...
First year at Gerard's then?
Yeah, well, we hope for insider knowledge really when we're here with Gerard, you know.
There can be a really massive investment, yeah, not just in terms of time, because it can take weeks, you know, to do a complicated lace shawl, for example. That can take weeks, but also money. You know, we only sell natural fibres here, and 100 grams of some of our yarn is £25, £30. So it can be really expensive. It's not the practical choice anymore necessarily. We get our yarn from all over the world. We've just had some delivered today from Germany and from Canada. There'll be some coming at the end of the week from America and South America. We do lots of different types of fibre, yeah. Alpacas are not strange anymore. Alpaca's really normal, and there's alpaca farms all over the UK, all over Europe. So there's even British alpaca now. We've got some buffalo, which is quite nice. But all of these odd, strange yarns are very expensive, so they don't sell that well. And they're good for a novelty for a few months and then get rid. I'm just making a scarf really. It'll just be a sample for the shop, but it's made out of llama, which is very fluffy and very soft.
The moment I'm knitting, it's called the Romance of Air Shawl. So basically it's been developed from a new film that's just come out, and I'm helping to test knit it. So it's been based on a shawl that was in the film, so we're kind of trying to get it to look like the shawl in the film.
The thing I like doing is looking at historical development of knitting, looking at how historical garments are constructed, and recently been doing something over the internet with the group on Ravelry where various members of the group had seen the new version of Jane Eyre, the film that's on release in the States, not out over here till November. They'd seen a knitted shawl in the film, they liked the look of it, they wanted to know about the textures, nobody knew who designed it, nobody who'd done whatever, so as a group we tried to deconstruct it and experimented with trying to come up with our own version of the pattern, and it ended up with about 30-40 of us from Canada, Australia, America, myself in the UK, people in Italy, all chipping in ideas about how to make it work, and we've all knitted our own variations and our own theme of it, and people are sharing that knowledge and the expertise about developing. Yeah, I do. I mean, a lot of the stuff, the internet is a really good tool for bringing the knitters together. There's a fabulous site called Ravelry.
Whoops, I rearrange my hands where I'm using the wool in that hand and what's called throwing it, passing it round the needle like that. And that if it comes out looking exactly the same, whichever style you use, it's merely the different method of controlling the wool. But I find this is knit one, purl one, rib, and I find that Continental is much easier for it. I can't quite take my attention completely off it like I can as if I knit English, but it's much, much faster. And the way the wool works is that it automatically goes into the right position for the next stitch, whether it's knit or a purl, and just makes it that little bit faster.
On the bus, on the tube, sometimes walking down the street, in the pub, wherever I am, I have to have my knitting with me. There are quite a few people in the group who are what I would probably term kind of genius knitters. They tend to sort of know everything, and if you run into any problems, you know that they're always going to have the answers. But we have kind of a good mixture of different level knitters, from beginners all the way up to really advanced. So I think it's really good. You know, we can all kind of chat to each other and consult each other when we have problems and things. I do knit gifts for people occasionally, but I'm a little bit more selfish than some of the other knitters, and I don't know, I just think if I put a lot of work into something, I either want to get paid for it or wear it myself. So a little bit more selfish with my knitting.
And in the future?
I do, yeah. I'm one of the few knitters who only has usually one piece of knitting on me. Most knitters, if you go in one of their bags, the knitters usually have at least 2 bags, and one of them is it'll be a couple of projects, and it'll be yarn that they've bought in the past week, or if they know they're going to see someone, then they'll bring that yarn to show them. But I usually have one thing. I'm a bit more practical,
you
I
get bored
suppose.
with one piece, so you're saying people often have 2, so if you're repeating one action...
Yeah, well, you never know what mood you're going to be in, do you? So you never know what bit of knitting you're going to want to do. Although I did have a train journey at the weekend, but I packed with a bit of a hangover, so I took the wrong knitting with me, so I couldn't do any.
You didn't want to do that one?
Well, I didn't. I took the wrong pattern and the wrong knitting, so they didn't mix up.
We had knitting lessons at school. I remember I was completely put off knitting in the round at all by the teacher at junior school, who decided we should all make mittens. And she cast them all on for us because we were 7 or 8 or so, and she didn't think we knew how to cast on. Well, I could have done, but hadn't knitted in the round. But she cast them all on the same size, and I couldn't get my hand inside mine. They hadn't got this sort of circular needle in those days, so we had to do them on 4 double-pointed needles. And you divide your stitches up, and you put about 1/3 of the stitches on each of 3 needles and just knit around them with the spare one. So you'll knit, say, 15 stitches, and then you have an empty needle and you use that to knit across the 15 stitches on the next needle and so on. And I absolutely hated it because I couldn't control 4 needles at once and I kept dropping them. And it wasn't until about 7 years ago when an American friend of mine came over here and married another friend, and she is an absolutely wonderful knitter. And she taught me how to knit socks from the toe up, which I'd never realised you could do before, and how to do it on 2 circular needles and then on 1 circular needle. I knit a lot of socks now, and she taught me how to do quite a lot of other things. This style of knitting that I'm using at the moment, for instance, she showed me, and it's called continental style knitting because it's what the majority of people on the continent use. Not everybody, but it's far more common.
Everything about my life has changed since I started knitting, really. Since I started the business especially. I've got a completely different circle of friends, an additional circle of friends, you know. I still got other people who friends who don't knit. But everything's changed. Yeah, I don't work in an office anymore, you know. I've got different stresses and different pressures, but they're not as bad as they were working in a horrible office.
I love the social thing. I think my entire social life revolves around people I've met from iKnit, people that you know, a lot of my social life actually revolves around the whole knitting community, not just iKnit, but I mean from here, yeah, I'll meet up with iKnit group members on other days, in other venues. We'll go off and do shows together, we'll go and see an exhibition together. You know, last week I went to the Tracy Emin launch. With one of the knitters I know from here, who's also a sculptor. So that was just really nice to get that sort of view. You know, I was interested in the textiles and the embroidery. She was looking at the sculpting and whatever, so we had a really good time with that, you know. And then came in here the following night and dissected everything that was on show.
We started iKnit London just as the kind of the interest in knitting really started to grow, and I had no idea. Really, I had no idea that there was millions of people, you know, in knitting groups up and down the country. There was knitters are very skilled at being online as well as knitting. They're very skilled at finding each other online. So there's very famous knitter bloggers and there's loads of groups up and down. But I started my own group because I didn't really like. There's very famous stitch and bitch groups, but I didn't really like the word bitch. I didn't really feel like I fit in with that, so I just started my own, and then it grew and grew.
Oh, the social aspect is a lot of it, yes, because I've been unemployed for 4.5 years now, and really the knitting is quite a big chunk of my social life now. There's a couple of other groups I go to as well. There's a new yarn shop, for instance, opened quite near where I live in North London, and I go there. But it does mean that I get out of the house, I get to see other people, I get to talk about something I enjoy doing that we all enjoy doing, among other things. I've got 4 projects with me. This is a scarf. And it's a pattern that a friend found for me on Ravel that's meant to be knitted with this particular yarn. And it's not coming out exactly like the originators, but I quite like the effect. Very slightly different on both sides.
Like a weave.
It does look a bit like a woven fabric almost, a tweeded fabric. But it's all because this particular yarn is space dyed in light green and medium green and dark green, and back to light green again, and it's a very, very regular colour change, so which means that you can do something like this. It's not an exact number of stitches. I don't think you could sort of say, oh well, that light green takes up exactly so many stitches and try and do bands, because whoops, the medium green isn't the same length as the light green. I don't think there's a competitive aspect to knitting, except insofar as if you're having a knit along where everyone's doing the same pattern at the same time, and someone will say, "Ooh, I finished mine first," or perhaps you spot something that someone else has done and you think, "Oh, I'll try that as well." but it isn't. I don't think it's terribly competitive really, unless you're doing it deliberately. There's quite a lot of sharing goes on. People share different techniques. People say, oh, have you seen this yarn? Have you tried doing this pattern? And so on. People have yarn swaps, for instance, where they invite people to come along and swap or sell or just exchange any spare yarn they've got hanging around. I think one of the more competitive things in knitting is perhaps my stash is bigger than your stash.
No, actually, no. I was actually looking at the turquoise yarn above your head because that's the colour I was looking for the next project, and you were asking me about yarns and how we budget for it.
I became a backing knitter for Chicks on Speed at a gig. I was on someone's mailing list, and Chicks on Speed, who were a kind of performance pop group band based in Berlin, were coming to do a gig in the East End of London, a place called Cargo, and they wanted some backing knitters. So I must have been feeling brave that day, and I said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. I was on stage for one of their songs, yeah. I can't remember which one, but I was on stage, there was about 5 or 6 of us behind them, and we were all knitting. But I because I have to stand out a little bit more than most people, I brought needles that were about 4.5 foot long, about 1 inch wide, like mop poles. And so I knit with those, and it was quite funny, really. It was a really big coming out moment. I'd never done anything like that before. I'd never really been on stage in public, and I mean, I wasn't performing, I was only in the background, but still, it was a big moment for me, yeah. And then this started then, really. But I've done so many things. I don't have any favourite pieces, because they're all favourite pieces, really. Most of the things that I make are for other people. I don't tend to wear anything knitted, but what I like isn't really suitable. What I like knitting is lace shawls mostly, and even though we're in London, and it's a free country, I'd probably be stoned if I walked around in lace shawls. So I tend to give them away or use them in the shop. They're dotted around the shop.